Well, as we're doing that, maybe we can do some introductions real quick
Yeah,
while we
that's a
get
great
to
idea.
since that's sort of the next part of the discussion. Um, Thanks so much, Suzanne, for kind of teeing us off. And then really great intro there on kind of what we do, advancing medicines, really speeding up innovation. This really, really fascinating company to be a part of. I guess I'll go first and I'll kind of turn it over to my partner in crime here for us to kind of give you a sense of who we are, why we're here, why we're talking about this. My name's Wah. I'm a director of U.S. Market Access here at Certara. Done my time in pharma doing a lot of enterprise strategy work, competitive intelligence, market intelligence, and am really much a self-described groupie of innovation that happens in healthcare. So I'm very excited about anything that has to do with change or trends, and things that really have a material impact on how we deliver healthcare, how we spur innovation in healthcare, and what that means for our businesses. So really great to be here to kind of go through some of these research insights with you. And Max, why don't you tell everyone a bit about yourself as well?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Wah. Max Vargas, Senior Director, U.S. Access Strategy here at Certara. I head up the U.S. Access Strategy Group, and at a core, what we do is what I like to characterize as substantiating and enhancing the clinical and the economic value of our clients' innovation. So that's really what we do on a day-to-day basis. And today, we're going to talk to you about some interesting original research that's been done, that this team did, to really understand the rare disease landscape is unique in many ways, but it is really what we're trying to do here is understand when or how really this category in general could start to look like a more managed category that we're all used to thinking about. So I see here we've got the slides back. So go back to you.
So really quickly, I think one of the things, in keeping with the Halloween theme, is we wanted to talk a little bit about our favorite Halloween costume. And as you may have seen briefly as a flash in the previous question, my favorite Halloween costume that I've been dressing up as for years now is an overworked office worker of some kind. You know, this pretty much just the general sort of feeling when you get into the Q3, Q4 time period. Max, why don't you tell everyone what your favorite Halloween costume is?
So I picked a tornado because that's what my 3-year-old daughter has requested and what we built last weekend. So she's got kind of like this fabric tornado thing coming off of her shoulder. Although interesting development last night, she decided that was not, we're going back to a pumpkin, which is what she was last year. So we'll see. We got a couple days yet.
Yeah, you can kind of merge them together too, right? Like a tornado pumpkin or a pumpkin colored
tornado. We could put a pumpkin in the tornado.
Yeah, there we go. There you go. That's I feel like there's probably some metaphor there surrounding the U.S. healthcare system, but maybe we'll get into that later on in the discussion. So we invite everyone here to kind of give us your thoughts on what is your favorite Halloween costume, or what will you be going as this year? And what are some of the results? Something from a TV show at 56%. Max, do you have a feeling or a guess on what TV show that might be? I have my thoughts, but what do you think when you see that percentage? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think maybe it's not so. I would probably pick one of the more popular movies nowadays. Maybe we'll see a lot of James Bond out there, or some Marvel characters. Who knows?
Yeah, I'm gonna stick with my standby for these things. Game of Thrones.
There you go.
Most likely TV show. But why don't we kind of kick the show off? And Max, I'll turn it over to you to kind of walk us through maybe why we did this and sort of the way that we did the research and kind of take us forward.
Sure. So these are the 3 main sections we're going to go through here today. And right now I'm kind of telling you why. The why here is really to stay ahead of any potential payer management strategies and tactics, and really advise our clients in a way that allows them to be successful in a new environment. And so the hypothesis here is that rare disease category as a group, maybe individually things are unique, of course, in each indication, but as a group, our hypothesis is that this category is going to see increased payer management in the future. That's contingent upon a couple of things, which we'll talk about. But the idea here is to put ourselves in the future market and understand what could be done to address that more aggressive management. So on the next slide, we'll go to kind of some of the particulars about what was addressed in this particular survey. So this was a survey. I'll get to the specs in a moment, but basically broken down into 3 sections. So we look at current management of rare disease categories, the general current approaches to doing that, PA criteria and all of the nuances there, et cetera, cross individual product to product cross management, things like that. Then we moved into a section on information availability to help us understand what types of information payers are leveraging to make and support those access decisions, and most importantly, what they feel they're lacking and what could be used to fill that gap. And then finally, the future management part, which we'll look at, is looking at the sort of the willingness and the ability to actually introduce some of that more aggressive management. So if we go to the next slide, we'll have a bit about the panel. This was a survey, 30 P&T committee decision makers. You can see it roughly a little bit heavier on the pharmacy side, 17 to 13 than compared to the medical directors. These are all current voting members of their organization's P&T committees, and you can see the individual splits there. About half the panel was from a typical health plan, 8 were from a PBM, and 6 were from an integrated delivery network with a healthcare delivery component. All in total, it's looking at just over 300 million covered lives in this panel of 30. So if we go to the next one, we have another poll question. And this one is related to, as you see there on the screen, how much of a share of a payer's budget is occupied by rare disease drugs? Take a moment, think about it, click your answer, because this really helps us set the context. Like, is this 50%? Is it 1%? Is it somewhere in the middle? I think we all need this context going into to this kind of discussion. So click your answers, and then we'll see where the audience is, and Wa's gonna take it over and tell us the answer along with some of the findings from our study here.
Yeah, so before we actually look at the results here, Max, I think you're a little biased because you've seen obviously this presentation, but where do you think that number is hitting? Where before you saw all of these figures and sort of the research findings, where would your sense be on this percentage?
Yeah, before I saw it, I would say I would be in the 6 to 10, if not a little higher than 10. Maybe 10 to 15. We don't really have that as an option, but that's what I would venture.
Yeah, so let's see the response here. So it looks like the majority of respondents are sort of answering definitely below the 10% mark, right? And
right.
You got a nice even split between 1 to 5 and 6 to 10. I see a few individuals said more than 25%. That's a lot of money there in terms of that percentage. So let's give you the actual answer here. The actual answer actually, kind of varies depending on what context you're looking at, right? And the major and the classical answer, when we think about 3.8 trillion in healthcare costs, healthcare expenditure, national healthcare expenditure, versus 48 billion when it comes to prescription drug expenditure for rare diseases. So the classic answer is going to be about 1.3%. So about 1% of the total American healthcare system, all of those dollars are going to paying for prescription drugs for rare diseases. Now, the reason why I said that there might be kind of like two answers, two different ways to think about it is this is, of course, drug spend over total spend, right? 48 billion is your total prescription drug spend across all medical expenditure, which includes medical care, hospitalization, all of that fun stuff. So the other answer to really think about is when you just look at rare disease as a component of drug spend only, that's about the 11% sort of mark, according to IQVIA. So about a tenth of total drug budget, drug spend, drug expenditure in America goes to paying for orphan conditions for rare disease products. So nearly $50 billion worth of spend here on the table. And to Max's point earlier, where we really wanted to focus on is when you're managing $50 billion in a condition in these orphan rare disease conditions, how are the payers thinking about it? How are they feeling about it? And where is this market going to go moving forward in time in the future, right? Potentially more competition or any sort of changes in attitudes. So if we can move on to the next slide, and it looks like we're sort of in the controller slideshow mode here a little bit.
Yeah. Guys, sorry about that. Any advice on that?
No worries. I think if you just Alt Tab, you should be able to bring it to the presentation. Maybe go ahead and stop the view, and we can just kind of go off the slides, kind of outside of slideshow mode. I think that's probably us being efficient and agile here. So while we're kind of getting that set up, right? You have that context. $50 billion worth of drug spend. How are the payers thinking about it? And to kind of put cart before horse a little bit, we're going to talk about some of our key executive summary findings before we get into some of the research findings here, right? So as we're kind of getting the presentation set up and some of the goblins wrenched out, I'll just go through and talk about the two key findings surrounding how payers are thinking about that $50 billion mark. So the first thing to really think about is the fact that payers feel constrained right now in their ability to actually direct where that $50 worth of spend is going. They feel constrained in their ability to manage rare diseases. And a lot of this is coming from the fact that there aren't many therapeutic options available. So when you only have one option as a payer, you're not going to cover it. You're going to make sure that your patients have access to a potentially life-changing medication. On the flip side, however, you have to cover it. So you're not quite, so even if, let's say, the product isn't hitting your payer expectations of efficacy or safety or actual improvement, you're sort of a little bit constrained because you have to make sure that there is something available for these patients. It's a bit of a rock and a hard place sort of perspective there. This is compounded, of course, by the fact that in rare diseases, you have a limited patient population. There might not be that sort of richness of data that you might see in an area like cardiovascular disease or diabetes that allows you to think about population management in a more sort of robust, top-down sort of fashion. So when you don't have that kind of data available, it becomes very difficult to piece out exactly when something is working, the circumstances it's working in, and the right patient that product is working in. Right. So there's a lot of lack of transparency, no real great sense of what constitutes success when it comes to rare disease treatment. And with all of this sort of in mind, the most common management sort of tool that payers end up using is reauthorization criteria, right? This idea that, I just want to make sure the thing is working. I want to make sure that after that initial sort of onboarding of the rare disease patient, that the product is actually delivering on its promise of helping that patient improve their lives. Now, in the future, we anticipate all of this, of course, changing as a result of all of the great innovation that's happening in the space. And payers are sort of betting on that. Payers are betting that there's going to be increased innovation in rare disease, which is going to result in more therapeutic options. And they're going to bet that to fuel that innovation, there's more data connectivity, more transparency in terms of what products are actually working in what patients. So from that sort of perspective, when you have more options available and you have better data that allows the payer to understand when something is working and when it's not, you now open the door for greater management. You open the door for greater certainty from the payer side. You open the door for more complex decision making. And you open the door for the payer to look at these therapeutic areas and say, $50 billion, I'm now able to really direct where that spend goes for the benefit of my patients. So you'll see all these findings sort of reflected throughout the rest of the data elements, sort of the nuanced explanation and details around it. I want you to keep those frames, those high-level concepts in mind. $50 billion worth of cost. Currently, very difficult to figure out whether that $50 billion is really working, at least from the payer perspective. Moving into the future, more certainty, more of that sense that, okay, I can now direct that $50 billion in a way that's going to be best for my patients and also for my books of business. Next slide, please. So one of the core pillars of how we kind of reached this conclusion was we tried to understand, well, what are they doing now and what are they sort of looking to do in the future? As you can see here, the majority of payers don't really, at least in our sample, don't really control for management in rare diseases, certainly to a far lesser degree than sort of your traditional primary care markets or even something like oncology, right? And again, reflecting the previous findings, the most commonly used management tool is that reauthorization criteria. And then, of course, they jump onto prior therapy requirements if there are other treatments available for that specific orphan indication. What really reads out here that's kind of interesting, though, is this sort of likelihood of implementation on some of these management steps that you see in the future, right? So the beautiful sort of rainbow colored graph that you have on the right hand side. And you'll see here that even for things that payers are doing right now, there's sort of this tepid likelihood of implementation. And a lot of this is because of that scarcity of data, right? Even if a payer wants to implement something in this space, when you don't have the data, when you don't have another therapeutic option, it's difficult to see a future where a payer would actually move on that. So the main takeaway that we get out from a piece of data like this is that sense of constraint, that level, that kind of feeling of like, you really want to do something, but you can't. Payers do want to come in and they do want to direct the spend more effectively. Some of them are doing it right now with reauthorization criteria, but in the future, in the absence of better data and more clinical options, it's very difficult for a payer to say, I have a high likelihood of really implementing this in that sort of an environment. Next slide, please. I think you see this reflected as sort of this next piece of data here, which is sort of understanding the payer context and sort of what value drivers they really assign to as a function of how many products are available. So you'll see here in the columns, you have a single product available, 2 products, 3 products, etc. And you'll notice that when you have only a single product available, the sort of current status quo, very constrained kind of environment, the picture looks a little bit different than when you go into an area where you have more competitive products and more competitive options available. Specifically, cost of plan becomes more and more important when you have more products in the market. Now, this is sort of a no-brainer kind of finding, right? When you have more products available in the market, then price becomes more and more of a consideration there. But what's really stark and really sort of a key takeaway here is that rare diseases aren't exempt from that sort of thinking. We oftentimes, I think in the innovator space, we think of rare diseases as areas for personalized care, areas for more targeted therapeutics. We're competing on value. And what this slide really tells us is that rare diseases, once you have more than 1 or 2 therapeutic options, the payer thinking behind it tends to behave very similarly to other traditional therapeutic markets. So this actually provides sort of support of this idea that rare diseases, the open sort of management here is more of a function of the number of products available than it is specifically towards the sort of level of value or the sort of level of unmet need, right? It's because these are hard to innovate for markets that there's open access, not necessarily because of another reason. So when you have more products, the payer decision making starts looking more and more like a classic traditional therapeutic area. Next slide, please. And when we think about what data, to talk a little bit about sort of that constraint, we wanted to kind of get the payer perception of, well, when you're thinking about management decisions, what gives you that certainty? What gives you certainty to know that something is working? And the most important piece of data, and I'm sure all of my colleagues who are listening in on this webinar can attest to, the most cited piece of data is head-to-head trials, right? So this idea that you can compare 2 products directly against each other, and 100% sure if A is better than B. That's stated here as well. Again, sort of a no-brainer kind of finding. What's really interesting about this is when we start moving into the middle cluster of fairly important pieces of data, then it becomes indirect comparative studies, cost-effective studies. resource utilization, and all of that fun stuff. And some of the things that we traditionally know that payers, may de-emphasize in terms of their thinking would be site of care, quality of life, and patient preference. But again, the interesting thing about this is the context this relates to rare diseases. Rare diseases is an area that is very data poor, right? There isn't a lot of information out there. There's not a lot of ability to be certain that's out there. And yet you're faced with this desire from payers to have more certainty, to put more emphasis on data to make their decisions a little bit more clearer, right? And I think that's a really interesting interplay because it suggests that the more information that you develop for rare diseases, the more payers are going to feel comfortable actually actioning on their mandate to control costs or to manage costs appropriately. Next slide, please. Now, one of the other important things that we wanted to think about is getting away from sort of the high level broadly, what data is important to you? We want to talk a little bit about, well, what data is important to you in the context of rare diseases, kind of building on that previous discussion point of data constraints and where does the payer not feel confident or not feel certain in terms of what data elements are out there. Now, currently, what we're really seeing is that payers are relying a lot on guidelines. They, of course, rely on randomized clinical trials. And third-party evidence. They sort of rely on traditional data elements, more of an emphasis on RCT data here, given that's probably one of the biggest forums for getting that sort of level of clinical certainty. But what's really fascinating again is that information gaps. Like, what are the pieces of data that payers feel is missing? And the biggest gap identified here again is that sort of lack to head-to-head data, this ability to be certain as to whether one product is actually more effective than another product. So when you think about entering a rare disease market as a second to market, third to market sort of asset, that there's going to be a lot more of an emphasis on how exactly are you directly competing with the previous sort of incumbent product, right? And again, I think the key takeaway here is the fact that we often think about rare diseases as areas where you command price via value, right? You're creating clinical value, you're creating something new for this space. And what all of this information is really showing us is that these product areas will behave similarly to other therapeutic areas when there is that sort of critical mass of therapeutics that are available on the market. When you have more innovation in this space, you're going to shift it probably more towards a cost-based or value-based, traditional cost-value sort of equation faster than any of us really anticipate. So looking at a rare disease sort of therapeutic area as a second to market, third to market as sort of like an area I can continue to compete on value may not actually hold true when we think about the future state of the world. Next slide, please. One of the other things, and kind of close out some of the data-heavy slides here, that we really wanted to just understand from the payer directly is, hey, what are you going to do about rare diseases in the future? Point blank sort of question that we wanted to ask them directly. And within the next 2 years, the majority of our sample really are going to look to implement more payer management controls within rare diseases. Sort of, again, the continuation of everything that we just stated, and that just you saw in the data in terms of how payers are thinking about the space and how payers are thinking about value in the space. Now, in terms of tactics for future management, the biggest one that we're going to see is probably step edits and prior therapy requirements, right? So again, this ties in very nicely with the idea that payers are anticipating the availability of not only more clinical options, but more data that allows them to be certain on which options are going to work where and when. So again, a lot of these themes are beginning to come together. The second sort of type of payer tactic that we see sort of tied in with the third one is, again, differential PA, favoring preference for a certain product, and reauthorization criteria. I think the biggest thing to come out of all of this data so far is that, again, it's sort of about certainty. You can kind of see throughout all these data elements, there's this idea of, I need to be certain that something is working. And in rare diseases, I'm not always 100% certain because there's only one thing on the market, or there's not a lot of data around that one thing or two things or whatever. So, in the future, as a payer, I am anticipating more transparency I'm anticipating that there is more of an ability for me to understand what's actually working. And based on that, I can then exact on my organizational mandate to ensure appropriate access to the right therapy for the right patient, AKA payer management of the space. What does that mean for pharma? Well, or other innovators in the space? Well, again, it means that the space will move away from the sort of pure clinical value that we all know and love into a space that's going to resemble a traditional therapeutic area, where you do need to start thinking about comparative efficacy, you need to start thinking about comparative pricing, overall relative value, as opposed to this idea that I will build something, it will work, and that people will flock to it. Right. So let's move on to the next slide. The next slide is going to be a bit of a poll question. So again, we've gone through a lot of data-heavy elements. We've talked a lot about this payer feeling of constraint. We've talked a lot about how they're looking and anticipating for new therapeutic options and new data to kind of come out. So what are you going to do about it? That's the question we want to kind of ask you guys. What are you specifically, after seeing some of this data, going to do about it from the perspective of an innovator? Or are you going to choose to do nothing? Or are you going to run away from the zombies and exit the rare disease space for the brighter pastures of gene therapy or oncology? So, we'll open the poll up, keep it up for a few seconds or so, a few more seconds, maybe about a minute. Feel free to take some time to think about it. What would you do in this future world? How would you change your strategy, if at all, to address some of the dynamics that we're talking about?
And while we're waiting for the results to come in, I wanted to just touch upon one thing you mentioned on the reauthorization criteria, which is really the kind of the key part that was one of the highest share management strategies that was done. This has a direct link back to the R&D and clinical development plan. So having data that allows payers to make decisions that are mutually beneficial to both the manufacturer and the payer, I think is critical here. So I'm really glad to see 52% here integrating commercial considerations into R&D. Also with the one just above it, create data to support clinical and commercial success. Very, very pleased to see that.
Yeah, I was very pleased to see 10%, so probably about 4 people or so, 10% say they would run away from zombies. That is good decision making. You never want to be caught by a zombie. So I applaud the 4 of you who have made the correct strategic choice surrounding the upcoming or whatever zombie apocalypse we might have. But Max, why don't we turn it over to you? So what would you do about it? What is your perspective on what companies, what innovators, what pharma, medtech should do, thinking about the future of orphan conditions or rare diseases?
Yeah, so we've got, our thoughts are kind of here on the slide, but as I kind of alluded to, it kind of comes back to your evidence generation plan, and having evidence that is, as I said, mutually beneficial to decision making on both the payer and the manufacturer side. That is going to, well, we've seen it happen where that is a very successful approach, or if you think about the opposite, where I'm just kind of focused on the regulatory endpoint, which may or may not be a biomarker, maybe an accelerated approval gets you a little bit faster time to market, but of course your data package is a little thinner than it probably would have been with a non-accelerated pathway. So there's a linkage here between the regulatory strategy and the commercial outcomes. So having that link established early in development, I think, is critical. And then so that's basically the third one here in yellow, which then populates the first item there in the dark blue, such that, and I'll get to, there's a question that came in actually related to the first box here, so I'll get to that in a moment. But really what we're thinking about here and what we're advising clients is to have an evidence generation strategy that meets both the regulatory and the commercial aspirations. And then the second box is really, having the right data to support payer decision making. It's a push and a pull, because rare disease, as you said, is inherently personalized, it kind of, I mean, just in terms of diagnosis and treatment and personalization of therapy. But then the payer is looking at it from a population perspective across their whole book of business, especially when you group up the rare diseases as we have to get to that 50 billion number, 48 billion number. So I think it's really providing enough data and the right point on your value story to help them make the right decisions there. So, Wah, if you don't mind, let's get to a question. I'll kind of repeat it for the audience, and then you can take it back at it. So the question here is basically, you know, we talked about the 48 billion being the prescription drug cost, but if that number balloons quite significantly if we add in the direct and indirect medical costs that payers are also responsible for outside of the pharmacy budget. Then we have, you know, a mention of productivity and employer costs. You know, the plan sponsors would care about productivity and so forth. So the question is, do you agree that it's not purely a price or unmet need question, but about how to present the value and the evidence economically, and how a drug will help manage the overall cost of these patients, including the medical and the pharmacy spend? What your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think it gets at the heart of not only market access, but really the heart of how you construct value platforms for therapeutics, right? Just as a whole. Short answer, absolutely the way that we do it and sort of the numbers that we're working with absolutely should be tailored on total cost of care, right? This is something that we've seen across multiple therapeutic areas, not just rare diseases, where the emphasis increasingly is not how much of your drug budget am I going to help you kind of lower, but how much of your total spend across the entire book of business, across the entire continuum of care, can I help you address, right? And certainly I think this has been bolstered by just better data and sort of a more holistic understanding of what healthcare is. You know, for rare diseases, for those of you who are still joining us today, you know, when we think about total medical costs, that's when you're, you know, according to the Every Life Foundation, you're hitting sort of like nearly $500 billion when you add up everything together. So 50 billion or so when it comes to just the drugs, but then nearly 500 billion when it comes to the hospitalizations and the total medical costs. And absolutely, I think that the value, the most precise way you would accurately estimate sort of the value, the economic value of a rare disease therapeutic is not only how much are you saving on the 50 bill, but how much are you saving on the 500 bill that's also associated potentially as part of the pie that you're kind of working off of. So absolutely agree there. What about you? What do you think?
Yeah, well, it just raised the question for me. So how do we think about that in our segmented market, right? Mm-hmm. Because we have a whole industry, the PBMs, dedicated to managing a pharmacy spend, right? And a lot of these rare disease products will hit that budget, but some of them won't. And yet the bigger nut to crack, so to speak, is in the medical cost driver. So, I mean, your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's also a really tough and thorny question to really think about, right? We all know that medical costs are traditionally kind of opaque as part of the DRG system. It's very complex. The cost that's billed back to the payer, depending on what contract you have with which provider, can get really complicated. I think there have been several studies that have looked at, for example, orthopedic surgery and just saw that the cost of care has been wildly different depending on like where you are, hospital you're going to, physician who's doing it, all of that. So it's definitely a tough question in terms of how are you kind of bridging these two together, right? So, you know, I think that the way that I think about this is that payers are, you know, you can sort of, as an innovator, rely on the payer at some point magically to come in and say, you know, we see the pharmacy costs, we see the medical costs, and we're going to bridge them together, and we're going to have a more holistic picture. But we also have to remember that these payers are fighting a lot of other battles in a lot of other disease areas. For me, where I see the most success is when pharma becomes a partner with the payer to help them put those pieces together. Now, whether that's crafting custom models that show or model budget impact based on literature, or whether that's something more direct in terms of working with them on a real world evidence study or a data study of some kind that takes real world experiences and translates them into a predictive way of understanding outcomes. The key point I want to leave with everyone that it's about, in my mind, collaboration. Can't go at it alone. I think we've moved past sort of the healthcare phase where companies just sort of throw things over a wall and just expect things to happen. I think especially in rare diseases, especially given the budget impact, especially Max, given your point about how difficult it is already in our current system to link medical costs with drug costs and figure out that total cost of care. It's about how do we do it together and how do we solve it together to make win-win situations for both of them.
Excellent. And I think we've got another question here, which is that, I'll just kind of summarize here. The industry as a whole has invested a lot of money and time into data generation and their HEOR and market access teams and that expertise. And yet there has been, at least the assumption here is there's been a negative correlation to access. And so the question is, how is the model going to work with our quote unquote misaligned incentives that we have in US healthcare through rebate contracting? And how can we change that for a rare disease innovator? How can we help that push and pull?
These are some tough questions. I don't know where these are coming from. These are like, future of healthcare questions. Whoever's asking them, like, do you want to run for Congress or something? This is a CMS question here. But I'm happy to take a stab at it, right? Like truthfully, the use of data in healthcare decision making has been both, I think, has been really transformative, right? In terms of just getting better transparency, better visibility of what's happening. And certainly some of that data is going to help payers, I think, take what innovators might think of as a negative stance in terms of I have a better way of figuring out what not to pay for, right, as opposed to what pays for. I tend to think about this from the perspective of that it opens the door for better conversations and more collaboration. And that's how you ultimately fix misaligned incentives, right? When you're talking about misaligned incentives, what you're really saying is that you and the person you're working with, in this case, if you're an innovator, you're working with a pharma, you're working with a payer. What you're really trying to say is that the two of your business models aren't meshing or matching in some way, and there's a little common ground there between kind of how you're making money and being sustainable and how they're making money and creating value, right? So for me, where I see some of these trends taking is just more open, more direct collaboration, and more of a sense of what we can do together that results in that sort of win-win situation. Now, tactically, what does that mean, right? Tactically, I think it means a few things. The first one is, when we approach these interactions, maybe looking at it less from an adversarial lens. I think, given my experience in pharma, we've often seen, especially with our other clients, they sort of treat market access not as an opportunity to kind of create value, but as a barrier they kind of have to jump through in order to get what you need out of the investment that you've made in R&D. And I think that sort of cultural attitude or positioning does a lot to, maybe make the relationship not as malleable or not as, productive for both parties. So maybe the first step is to kind of think about some of the mindsets and some of the behaviors that we have when we're approaching market access. And really zero in on what's the goal. Is the goal really for us just to get a product onto the market and make sure it's paid for, or is the goal to work with the payer to make sure it gets to the right patient and structure out a proper incentive plan that we can both agree to? That means we're sharing in mutual success. And I think one great example of this sort of beginnings of these sorts of collaborations is if we take a look at what Pfizer did with Xalkori, working with a payer, working with this idea of using warranties to set up a value-based contract, working within the system, hand in hand in some ways, to really create a new model of interaction, a new model of doing things. So for me, again, just to kind of recap, data, definitely transformative. I think it opens the door for greater collaboration, better conversations. And tactically, what that means, maybe we start by not approaching each other as enemies, but approaching each other as opportunities for better and more, more optimal shared value.
Well, and I'll just tack on to that as well. There is an opportunity, I think, to engage specifically for a rare disease developer, engage payers, particularly those with integrated medical and pharmacy claims, a lot earlier in the development process, so that you can kind of go on that journey of understanding who are these patients, where are they, what are their costs like, the timing, because you can have years across, from sort of symptoms to actual true correct diagnosis in some cases. I think kind of, as you were saying, wow, the collaborative nature, going on that journey together is maybe a mindset that developers should think about going forward, because then you're in there together. Everybody's kind of clear and knows what's going on.
Yeah, I want to piggyback off of that real quick also, and just make a note for everyone who's on the line that this collaboration is not, I think we're referring to it not only as innovator and pair, like pharma and pair, but also internally within your own R&D process, the collaboration between R&D and commercial and market access, right? Like, we're moving into a time where designing products in isolation of the real world environment it will be used in, whether that's the payer context, the patient context, whatever. Designing products in isolation gives you less success than if you're designing with that market in mind. And for pharma, tactically, what that really means is that your commercial teams and your R&D teams, they have to be talking to each other, and they have to be talking earlier in the process. The traditional drug development process is very much a waterfall, right? Like, asset hits this milestone, great. Hits the second step, hits this milestone, great. At this point, maybe we bring in our market access folks. That's when we do our commercial assessment. That's when all of a sudden, maybe something bad happens in terms of our profitability model, like the budget model doesn't look great, the forecast model suddenly looks bad. We have to suddenly pivot and think about, oh no, what do we do about this clinical trial? Do we pull the asset? Avoid all of that sort of challenge by simply making sure your teams are interacting earlier in the process and standing up these sustainable processes to make sure you have shared learnings and all of the members of your organization are aligned as to the patient, the market, and the type of stakeholder that you're targeting with your intervention. And I think for rare diseases, that's so critical as well, given some of the dynamics that we've talked about today in terms of the future management, right? You can't build this in a lab anymore. It has to be built sort of with that real world framing in mind.
Great job, Max and Hua. We've gotten some really great questions from the audience. I think we've got time for one more question before we wrap up. What do you think is the likelihood that some of these changes actually happening such that payer management is going to be introduced into these areas?
Yeah, it's, I know we've been speaking about rare diseases as a group, as a whole, but one of the slides Hua showed where we kind of built the market from 1 product to 2 products to 3 products, all similarly indicated, that's really for me the defining factor. That's the trigger point, is that when you have, and yes, all the clinical data is going to be slightly different in each one, but generally 3 competitive products. That's probably where we're going to start to see some additional management. As far as actual likelihood of that happening, it's really related to how many we get to, how many, it's related to the competitive environment, how many are coming in and in development and will actually get approved, and with what relative data packages. Hua, any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think that, one of the things I always love to say about the world, the sort of in general, is that, things are true until they're not. And I think for rare diseases, what we're really seeing is, again, things are true until they're not, until you hit that flashpoint where you have that second or third product, until you hit that flashpoint where you have more data. And I think if you look at the overall trend in terms of spend, in terms of how much interest there is in looking at orphan conditions for new innovation. If you think about how in pharma most of the low-hanging fruit kind of early therapeutic targets have probably been captured, by now, you're going to see a sort of rapid acceleration of interest in rare diseases. It also happens to be a place where you can command a better margin than some of the primary care areas like diabetes or cardiology. So for me, I think that this is much more of a certainty, and I think the pace in which this is going to happen is a function of the clinical innovation activity in the space as well as the amount of data that's available, and both of those trends are happening exponentially as we kind of think about healthcare. So for me, it's definitely going to happen. The question is not if, but when. And I think the when is going to happen much sooner than maybe any of us really anticipate. And for all the innovators on the call, what that means for you is you got to stay ahead of the curve, man. You got to think about some of these issues and then plan, whether that's thinking about it, having discussions, or an actual tactical strategic plan. You have to think and prepare for those sort of future eventualities. So definitely is going to happen, but it's going to be exciting to see when the switch gets flipped.
I think that's a great great note to conclude on. Max, anything else to add, or should we wrap up?
I think we're all good. Thanks everyone for your attention and great questions. Those were not softballs. Thank you.
Those were pretty much punches to the gut there over and over. I'm like, man, is this a congressional inquiry? Are you like hauling me around? I'm not CEO of Medtronic yet, guys. Like, come on, like, not quite there.
Yeah. Well, great questions, great discussion. Thank you so much, Max and Juan. Thank you so much to our audience for their thoughtful commentary and their attention. On behalf of Certara, this concludes the webinar. I'd like to thank you for attending. Have a great day and goodbye. We'll see you next time.
Email us if you have questions.
Thanks everyone. Take care.
Bye, guys.